Today we are making a super easy pet bow, perfect for your pet. Welcome, I do sewing and DIY related content, and today we're going to be making a pet bow that you can slide onto your pet's collar. So as you can see here, I have my dog's collar, and the first step is you are going to want to measure this to see how big that width is. So this is about 5/8 of an inch, and now we're going to be using this to figure out the size of our bow. So now the best part about this bow is that there's actually a whole Etsy pattern available, so you can see that the largest size bow ends up being about an inch, a little bit larger for that width. So for this bow pattern, all the dimensions are listed in the Etsy pattern, but we are going to be cutting out 4 different rectangles. So our first is this large rectangle, that's going to be our main bow portion. The second is going to be 2 smaller rectangles, and then we'll have a third set of rectangles, which is just 1 rectangle, and then we're going to have 2 pieces of elastic. Now, like I said, all of these are included in the Etsy pattern description. There is 3 different size bows that you can choose from. I'm going to be making the largest size bow today for this pattern. So the first step we're going to be doing is taking the largest piece of our rectangle, so this very large piece rectangle, and we are going to be folding it in half, so almost hamburger style as you can see here, and I'm going to be pinning up 2 of these edges, so the 2 edges that are actually next to that folded edge. And then for the edge that's directly across from the folded edge, you're going to be going into the center and leaving a 2-inch gap. So I like to mark gaps with 2 pins so that I know that this is going to be where I'm starting and stopping. And so what we're going to be doing is we are going to be starting from the one edge all the way at the folded corner, then sewing all the way up, leaving a gap, and then repeating that same seam on the other side. Now we are also going to be prepping our little elastic component that will be attaching to the collar. So you can see I have these 2 matching rectangles, and I am just going to be laying out the pieces of elastic, so this is 1/2 inch elastic, on about 1 inch away from the edge, and then putting the other fabric on top so that we have almost an elastic sandwich, as you can see here. And then I'm just going to be pinning this all together. So now this is the component that's going to allow us to slide the bow on and off the dog's collar. So for this, we are going to need to leave a small gap at either one of the edges. It really doesn't matter what edge you choose. As you can see here, I'm using that top portion. So sewing the elastic in place and then leaving that gap up at the top. This will then allow us to turn this bow right side out once we get it all sewn up. So now the last rectangle we need to deal with is actually going to be the middle portion of our bow. So now we are going to be folding this over, so either of those long edges over about 1/2 inch. Now if you're making the smallest bow pattern, it's going to be more along the lines of 1/4 inch, but all of that is listed in the Etsy pattern in the description when you purchase that pattern document if you're interested. So as you can see here, I'm just going to be pinning all of this up, and then we're just going to be taking 2 straight seams, one on either edge to hold that in place. So I'm going to be starting with this piece first, so I'm just going to go ahead, I have this all lined up, so using about 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I'm just going to begin sewing. I'm going to be using a straight stitch, being sure that I am back stitching at the beginning as well as the edge to keep this secure, and then I'm just going to be sewing all of this in place for the one side. Now once you have that one side done, you can see here that because of my fabric and I'm using a very similar color thread, it's hard to see, which is perfect. So now we are just going to repeat those exact same steps for the other side. Now we have one more step to do for this little portion, and we are just going to be folding over one of the short edges by 1/2 inch as well. So I'm going to be folding this over and then taking that 1/4 inch seam and just sewing this up so that I have 3 of the 4 edges are now completely sewn off. We don't have any more of those raw edges, and this is going to allow us to have the center of our bow and give us a really nice and clean finish. Now I'm going to take the elastic rectangle that we created, and starting at that first double pin mark, begin the sewing process. So I have it all lined up here, again taking around 1/4 inch seam allowance, going down to the first edge, pivoting, sewing the second edge, pivoting again, and then doing the third edge. And then here I'll kind of show you when I pivot, I'm putting my needle into the fabric, lifting up my presser foot, turning my fabric, and then putting the presser foot back down and continuing sewing. So this way I'm able to do all of these stitches in one continuous go instead of having to start and stop. And then for this again, I am being sure that I'm back stitching at the beginning and end, and now I have this all sewn up. So now I'm just going to set this to the side, and now all I have left is that larger rectangle. So I'm just going to do the exact same steps of sewing up the edge, so doing about 1/4 inch seam allowance, just taking a straight stitch, pivoting at that corner, and then when I get to my double pin marker, I'm going to stop, so being sure to back stitch, then take the needle out, undo the thread how you would if you were stopping your stitch, and then I'm going to restart all of this at that next double pin mark. So you can see here I am leaving that gap, so this is going to allow us to turn this right side out. We want to leave that unsewn, and I'm just going to continue sewing on my way all the way around the rest of this main portion of the bow. Once you have this completed, you can then go through and trim any of the extra threads you have. If you want to trim off any of those corners, any extra fabric, being sure not to cut into the seam itself. And then we are going to be turning all of this right side out. So here is currently what my bow looks like. I'm now just going to turn this right side out. The cat wanted to help the entire time with this, so it definitely was a little challenging. If you have any issues though when you are turning this right side out, you could definitely use one of those like little turning tools or some sort of pencil, just kind of poke those edges for you. Now I'm going to do the same clipping steps for this elastic portion. Again, the cat was very helpful during this. And then I'm going to turn this right side out, and then the final step is for that other rectangle we have, just trim off any of those threads. So as you can see here that some of the corners were getting a little harder on the elastic portion, so I'm just using a pencil eraser, just kind of poke it out. So right now I have all of my pieces and they're ready to go, so it's really just time to start assembling our bow. So before we do this, we are going to press the main bow portion as well as that one smaller rectangle so it's nice and flat. You do not need to do this for the piece with the elastic. So I'm just going to press it out to make sure that it's all nice and flat and smooth. And then what's going to be time to do is close up those holes that we had in both the main bow portion and the elastic. So that gap that we had used to turn, we need to sew these up. So I am just going to be hand stitching this closed, so using a needle and thread. And then I'm going to thread the needle, and then I have my two ends of my thread here, so I'm just going to knot those. And then I'm going to take the opening and just very carefully put my needle in. I like to do a little knot at the beginning just to make sure that it's nice and secure. And then once I have that knot on there, I'm going to put the edges, the ends of my thread just into the opening, and then I'm just going to take a ladder stitch or an invisible stitch. You're not really going to be able to see this, especially if you're using a thread of the same color as your fabric, but an invisible stitch helps it so that you're not able to see it even more. Now I'm going to repeat those exact same steps to close up this little elastic portion, and now everything is ready to start assembly. So you should have 3 pieces when everything is done, and now our first step to assemble is we are just going to pinch this main bow portion. So I'm just pinching this closed. You can then adjust this however you would like, but I also have some thread, and I'm just going to be tying the thread around the middle to kind of hold this pinch in place. Now this is more of an optional step, but I found that it really did help, especially when you were trying to get the middle portion of the bow on. It just gave you a little bit more of a guide for how big or small you needed to have it be, but again, totally up to you if you'd like to do that. So now that my bow is a little more pinched, almost like a bow tie pasta noodle, I am then just going to wrap around that extra rectangle that we had, being sure to adjust it however I would like it to be. And then as you can see here, I have the back portion, so the edge that we're able to see is actually that one that we sewed up so that we can't see any of the raw edges. And then I'm just going to hand stitch this in place. So for this, nobody's going to be seeing it, so no need to do an invisible stitch. You could do whatever type of whip stitch you would like. And at this point, you actually have a bow. So now it's just time for us to attach this bow to our elastic portion here. And again, this all just comes down to hand sewing. So you can decide how you want your bow to be placed on the elastic. I chose to do it right in the middle. And then as you can see, there is both like a top portion as well as a bottom portion that we would want to attach this onto. So this is going to be the same steps if you are making a small, medium, large size bow. You're going to want to attach the bow both at the top portion of your elastic as well as the bottom. So I just did a little whip stitch. You really won't be able to see this too much since it's on the back. And once you have it attached, this is what it looks like. So you could make these in so many different colors and so many different types. If you don't have 1/2 inch elastic, you could definitely use a 1/4 inch elastic and then put 2 pieces on either side as well. So if I take my dog's collar now and unclasp it, and then you can see that I have these little elastic portions, I am just going to guide the collar through the elastic, and then I'm going to be able to put it in place. Now the bow that I'm using here, this is actually the medium size bow, so I found that the medium size works really well on like that 5/8 inch collar, and then that large would be for a larger size collar, and then when you're done with it, you can just slide it right off. I find these so fun and easy to do. Again, there is a whole Etsy pattern available if you want even more step-by-step instructions to include all of the sizes. You can even make your own bow as well. I have an Etsy pattern for that. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe.